Still sinking it in, aren't we? I think what is really nice is the small gap between sessions, just a few moments to savor what we have just experienced and readying ourselves for the next. So it's not just about, going at a speed that doesn't allow you to enjoy. And in any case, they were talking a lot about the physical space, the form, so the session coming next sits very comfortably into this. Working with both physical spaces across the art spectrum, lecture demonstrations which create the classroom ambience. Sadhana Rao is here to speak on the exact space between meter and melody and ensuring that we all tune into that gap. Over to you, Sadhana.
Just give me a second for setup time. I'm not able to see the screen and there's a presentation. At the console, I'll just say next or play the music. And if we can just come on to the first slide. Musings of meter and melody. Music, a sonic and auditory landscape. And that's where the connect lies. Each art form building on the other, as we saw in the previous session of dance and poetry, so it is in music. That he was a poet influenced by music. Music composer Hector Berlioz wrote his symphony in 4 parts, Harry in Italy, based on the principal character of Lord Byron's epic poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimages. And it is this study that is extremely fascinating to a researcher. Next slide, please. So this session is premised on the interconnectedness of the arts. There's a little story that I've composed to show their journey, how they mingle and merge, their presence in society, their grammar, and finally how they both mirror what happens in society. Next. I'm sorry, we've gone a little further. The slide should be presence and connections. Is it that? Okay. The presence of poetry and music has had a very compelling presence in society. Music making, in almost all civilizations has been one of the most participatory forms of art. Everybody has a collective and an individual relationship with sound, and organized sound called music. Poetry as a contemplative tool, as a creative tool, and also as a form of rhythmic language, because it existed much before the text had come in. So societies have placed a very high premium, have held these 2 art forms in extremely high esteem. Probably the best examples of this would be in the sung poetry that we have a legacy of. To give you a few illustrations, the tanka poems from Japan, the Japanese tanka poems, they are a 31-syllable poem written in an unbroken, traditionally written in an unbroken line. Tanka loosely translates to a short song. This compares with the Kabir Doha. The Samaveda, a treatise very well revered in the Hindu scriptures. Now the Samaveda is entirely sung. The 1600 odd verses, some extrapolated from the Rig Veda, are not chanted, are not recited, I beg your pardon, but they are sung. As early as the 3rd and the 4th century, you had professional artists called the rhapsodists, who used to sing Greek epic poems called Greek rhapsodies. with this legacy, one wonders the question, how did this all arrive? When you recite poetry, merge it with music, it appears extremely organic. It doesn't seem as if there's a huge work behind, but actually, both these disciplines rest on a very, very complex grammar. Next slide, please. The slide is on crisscrossing pathways. If you see, that's poetry and music for you. As I said, both of them rest on a very, very vast grid of grammar. If I take music first, the structural elements of music are melody, rhythm, and harmony. Very quickly, melody is an arrangement of notes. In the Indian tradition, in the Indian classical tradition, it would be the rag. The rag has a set of notes. It moves in a certain grammar in its ascending and descending, and that's what creates the melodic patterns. In Western classical tradition, it would be the scales, the major, the minor scales, which give you the mood and the way the notes have to move. Rhythm is really music in terms of time. Harmony is where single sound, multiple sounds come together in a huge compendium as a composite whole. Now, these are very, very simplistic definitions I'm giving. Students spend a lifetime studying these, and these have great nuances. I turn now to poetry. The poetic devices, if I take two examples, the poetic meter. The poetic meter is defined by the syllable, and the way the syllable pattern moves across a line. The way like water would be two syllables. The way the poetry moves, it has an inbuilt rhythm. There is a heartbeat to the verse. Now, when complex patterns of rhythm, could be Deepak Chand, could be Roop Tal, could be any 8-cycle beat, when the complex pattern of rhythm meets with the complex pattern of the poetic verse, an entire new layer and an entire new pattern is given. If there is a repetition in the poetry, the repetition becomes the chorus in the song. If another poetic device, which is the assonance. The assonance in simplistic terms is repetition of vowels across a line. This sound, while reading it in poetry, almost mimics a sound of a musical note or a chord. When melody, and the assonance in its own turn has a rhythm. When melody layers onto the melody of the poetry, that is another composition. So it is, scholars over the years have added to this repertoire of research and grammar, and that's how from the ancient text to the contemporary, we see how the grammar works to bring these two art forms forward. My apologies if I'm a little slow because the iPad sort of switches off and I need to keep. Let's pivot to a, what would the slide be? Would it be musical and poetic travels? Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So we saw the grammar that allows for fluid interactions in art, and art strives for fluid interactions. One of the facets of arts is fluidity and being able to be migratory. Music and poetry are no difference. They, right across civilizations, they have not stayed in the geography of their creation. I refer to a song which I'm sure most of you have heard, Auld Lang Syne. This was created by Robert Burns in the year 1796. It was published posthumously. Robert Burns lived in Scotland. He built on a Scottish melody. With its meter, melody, messaging, it traveled all over the world. Translators translated it in English, and that's it, it owned the world. 90 years later, in Bengal, Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore hears the song. The song becomes a echo point for him, a muse point for him, and in the language of Bengal, state of Bengal, Bengali, he composes a song, Purano Sher Diner Kotha, which is reminiscent of Auld Lang Syne. This is 90 years. How Auld Lang Syne, born in Scotland, gives a toss to his geography and gains world domination. I'd like you to hear the rendering in English. It is by a dear friend, Indira, a musician. She was an integral part of setting up a band called the Sami Sisters, which she set up with her sister Usha Utub and her sibling. Give me a second till I give instructions to the console. So you have to go to the slide Auld Lang Syne, which has an icon of a musical icon. Could somebody respond to me from the console? It would be slide 7.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and old Lang Syne? For old Lang Syne, my dear, for old Lang Syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for the sake of old Lang Syne. We too have run about the slopes and picked the daisies fine. We'll take a cup of kindness yet for old Lang Syne. For old Lang Syne, my dear, for old Lang Syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for the sake of old Lang Syne.
That was Indira singing it in the traditional English style. It's musically, this is the pentatonic scale. A lot, and this was one of the earlier scales that came in music history. World over, there's a lot of music, world culture puts a lot of emphasis on this music. Musically, if I were to pick up, this song many musical composers have arranged. As a researcher, if I were to pick up 2, they would be Beethoven has composed on his Scottish melodies, Auld Lang Syne. He's done it in the Western classical tradition. The sensitivity that Beethoven brought to his music is he actually used a rhythmic pattern called the Strathspey-Ridden pattern, which is used in Scottish dance to get that authentic sound. The other would be, for its uniqueness, what singer Cliff Richard did in 1999, The Turn of the Century. In his album, in his individual solo, Millennial Prayer, he sang the Lord's Prayer, the words over the melody of Auld Lang Syne to commemorate what Auld Lang Syne stands for. Poetically, this poem, Robert Burns picked up an old Scottish melody and he developed upon it. During his lifetime, there were doubts, there was a controversy, but posthumously it was published, giving him credit. This poem has a lot of features. It's a poetry student's delight. It has the features of a Scottish folk song. It has the style of an old poetry which is written in a stanza format, 4 lines with a quatrain. One part of the poetry is like a ballad with a rhetorical question. Without getting too technical, the poetry also features something called the iambic meter, which allows for 2 or 3 vowels to be in a single line for it to get effects. That was Auld Lang Syne, 1796. And here we are still talking about its longevity, which is what art really strives for. Just change the slide. Abhi at Puranosher Diner Kotha. Unbroken melody. I'd like you to hear the Bengali version, and then I'll speak about it. Please play the track.
পুরানো সেই দিনের কথা ভুলবি কি রে হায়ো সেই চোখের দেখা প্রাণের কথা সে কি ভোলা যায় পুরানো সেই দিনের কথা ভুলবি কি রে হায়ো সেই চোখের দেখা প্রাণের কথা সে কি ভোলা যায় আয় আর একটিবার আয় রে সখা প্রাণের মাঝে আয় মোরা সুখের দুঃখের কথা কব প্রাণ জোড়াবে তাই মোরা ভোরের বেলায় ফুল তুলেছি দুলেছি দোলায় বাজিয়ে বাঁশি গান গেয়েছি বকুলের তলায় হায় মাঝে হলো ছাড়া ছাড়ি গেলেম কে কোথায় আবার দেখা যদি হলো সখা প্রাণের মধ্যে পুরানো সেই দিনের কথা ভুলবি কি রে হায়ো সেই চোখের দেখা প্রাণের কথা সে কি ভোলা যায় সে কি ভোলা যায় সে কি ভোলা যায়
That was Meetu Banerjee, one of my gurus of Hindustani music. She's from the Betiya Gharana. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, in his decades of career, wrote 50 volumes of poetry in almost every form: ode, sonnet, a dialogue poem, ballad. Here, I'm going to take a little liberty to step away from pure research to mention an anecdote which gives you into the mind of the composer-poet that Rabindranath Tagore was. When Meetu and me were doing research on Tagore and his poetry, we met with the family. India's loss that we've not documented it, but the family shared doodles with us. The doodles go to show that during the composition of Puranosher, he thought of it in terms of music. Now there's a beautiful rag in Hindustani called Rag Bhupali. Now this rag is about friendship, love, loss, shared acquaintances, exactly like the poem. While he was composing it, he said this is going to be in Rag Bhupali. While grammar on one hand can help, grammar can be restrictive. Rag Bhupali does not have the notes, does not have the notes ma and na. Now, when you look at the song Puranosher Diner Kotha, there's so much of na in the notation that Tagore said, no, we'll break the law, but we'll call the rag Jangli Bhopali. He did not give it a term which would be very favorable. He said, no, let's just call it Jangli Bhopali. It's in the doodle. Unfortunately, this has not found its way into research documents, so hence I put the note that it's an anecdote, but I did want to share it with you all to know that here is a poet who actually thought of music and has about almost 4,000-5,000 songs converted from poetry into music. Can we go to the next slide? Let's shift gears and cruise to another point where both poetry and melody mingle. It's in the Hindustani classical tradition, but the vocal genres that I've selected are Thumri and Dadra. If you can go to the next slide. Now, if you take a look at this slide, this is really like the grammar that we saw between poetry and music. In Thumri and Dadra, the text is as important as the melody. The rag makes allowances for the text, which may not be really what we follow in Drupad and Khayal, where it is on the tonal formations and the unfolding of the rag. So in a Thumri format, there are times where the text breathes music and where the music breathes the text. I'd like you to hear Dr. Tanvi, and then I'll speak about it. Can you go to the next slide and play the music?
छवि दिखला जा बाकी सवरिया सवरिया ओ सवरिया सवरिया रे सावरिया सवरिया रे सवरिया रे ध्यान ध्यान लगो मोहे तोरा छवि दिखला जा बाकी सावरिया सवरिया रे ध्यान लगो मोहे तोरा बाके सावरिया सवरिया रे बाके सावरिया सवरिया रे बाके सावरिया सवरिया रे
I think we can stop.
बाके सावरिया
That was Dr. Tanvi singing a traditional Thumri. Now, a little about the poet. The poet was a lesser known poet from Banaras, Munakki Devi. Munakki Devi was married to a Vidwan, a Sarangi Vidwan from Banaras, and so she internalized the music, whereby understanding what instrumental music was and what is the vocal tradition. Traditionally, a Thumri would have sthai, the first part, which is the opening line, and the second, which is the antara. If you notice, this rag, Tanvi, and she sang it in rag Khamaj, which is a rag which is used for Thumri. The tal, because there is a underlining meter in the traditional poetry, the tal that has been selected for this Thumri is a tal called Deepak Chand. Deepak Chand has 14 beats and it's asymmetrical, which allows for the words to play into the music. Can we change the slide to Dadra?
मत मारो तलवरिया नयन की मत मारो तलवरिया नयन की मत मारो तलवरिया काहे कुसान देत भवन को काहे कुसान देत भवन को काजल नैनन भरिया नयन की काजल नैनन भरिया नयन की मत मारो तलवरिया
We can stop the
नयन
music.
की
At this stage, I'd like to record a thanks to all the musicians. Each of these compositions are actually for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just to give you the soul of the music. They've actually sung it and have done it virtually. So now, this again was sung by Dr. Tanvi. A dadra is slightly different from a thumri in the sense that the thumri is sung in a slow tempo, whereas a dadra has a faster pace. Dadra has another speciality of having a tal which is called dadra. It's an 8-cycle beat divided into 4, so it allows the music to move at a meter. The composition remains the same, the sthai and antara. The liberty that happens here is that the sthai could be in Braj Bhasha, in Hindi, and the antara could be in Urdu, which just goes to show how the classical arts actually just merged together into one. There were no borders and boundaries defining them. The text of the Thumri is always devotional, but primarily sensual, erotic. It's about Lord Krishna, his relationships with the consorts, lament of the beloved's absence, arrival of the beloved, excitement at the beloved's arrival. The language is, because this art form of Thumri and Dadra grew in Banaras and in Uttar Pradesh, the language is Hindi, Braj Bhasha, Awadhi. There is a tendency to say that Thumri and Dadra are semi-classical forms of music. As a practicing researcher, I stay away from these labels, as at the end of the day, they are art forms. Begum Akhtar, Shubha Gurto have performed the Thumri and Dadra and have given absolute virtuosity to this art form. So for us, they just remain expressions of art. Just play the next slide, please. No, we've done this. Just come to explosions of expression. As I come to my concluding segment, this is the cultural map of India. Starting from the 11th century onwards. there was a movement called the Bhakti movement, which started in Tamil Nadu and went on from Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and then swept the entire country. A movement which lasted several centuries. What did this movement give us? This movement gave us an explosion of music forms. Existing forms got identified, defined, and new forms came, chief among them being the form of Qawwali and Amir Khusro's creation. So art mirrored a certain movement in society. Can we go to the next slide, please? One of the most popular poets of this Bhakti movement was a poet called Kabir Das. Kabir, in his lyrics, in his words, never thought musically. But today, his verses are sung 500 years since. The reason of Kabir's absolute connect and pulse with the audience has been because the Bhakti movement brings in a change from the Vedic strictures. The meter of the poem has become more relaxed. During the Vedic time and the Sanskrit chanting, it was a very rigid control of every breath could count so many syllables. Whereas with the Bhakti movement, that changed. It became an outpouring of devotion. Anybody could sing, anybody could narrate their feelings into poetry. What Kabir did is he took, as in the Japanese tankha, which I mentioned earlier, he took a two-line, which is called the Doha or the Sakhi, has 24 matras, just divided in the center with a small dot, which allows the person to read it at his or her convenience. When translated, the dohas become about 4 lines.